Okay, well, hello everybody. Welcome to our fourth session of our University of Michigan Engineering Education Research Seminar Series for the year. I'm Cindy Finelli and I direct our EER program. And as you probably know, this year we've been able to leverage our seminars to both amplify the work of Black and other minoritized scholars and to showcase the research about the experiences of minoritized engineering students and/or engineers. And today I'm super excited to be able to welcome one of our own University of Michigan colleagues, Rosemary Perez, who is a faculty member in the School of Education. So I will turn it over now to Robin, our EER seminar coordinator, to do the formal introductions. Thanks.
I really enjoy this role as the seminar coordinator, partly because I get to meet such wonderful people. And I'm excited today to introduce Rosemary Perez, Dr. Rosemary Perez, who is an associate professor in the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education here. She earned her BS in Biological Sciences and Psychology at Carnegie Mellon, her Master's in Education in Higher Ed and Student Affairs at University of Vermont, and her PhD here. Her scholarship has three interrelated lines of inquiry and explores how people make meaning of collegiate experiences, diverse learning environments and intercultural development, and the professional socialization of graduate students and new practitioners, particularly relevant for this talk. Across projects, she explores the tensions between structure and agency and how power, privilege, and oppression affect individuals and groups within higher ed. Her research has been funded by NSF, Spencer Foundation, Susan Thompson Buffett Foundation, and ACPA College Student Educators International.
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. I'm going to start sharing my screen. All right. So excuse me as I do my tech test. I feel like this is a good test of one's coordination. So again, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Rosie Perez. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an associate professor in the Center for the Study of Higher and Post-Secondary Education at the University of Michigan. I would like to thank Dr. Cindy Finelli and Robin Fowler for their efforts to coordinate today's talk. And today I'm going to share some of my work with you about graduate education, and in particular, how we might engage the role of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI, in engineering grad ed. So before I do that though, I would like to acknowledge that I join you today as a visitor and settler on the lands of Indigenous peoples. The University of Michigan resides on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, or people of the Three Fires, namely the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. In 1817, these nations ceded this land through the treaty at the foot of the rapids, some of which was designated for a college at Detroit, at which Indigenous peoples were eligible to enroll. As I occupy this land, I affirm and acknowledge the Indigenous peoples who live here now and those who were forcibly removed from this space. I also acknowledge the historic and ongoing struggles for Indigenous sovereignty, the effects of colonial violence, and the erasure of Indigenous peoples. I'm also really cognizant that the erasure of Indigenous peoples often occurs through research, including my own. And that being said, I hope that we might work together to embrace Indigenous ways of knowing. Okay. So I think we've done the formal introductions. I think it's also very helpful for people to know some information about me and why was I asked to come here today as a non-engineer to join you. So I will position myself in the work today. So first, I'm here as a second generation middle-class Filipina American who was raised and educated in the predominantly white suburbs of the east side of Cleveland, Ohio. I'm here as someone who's a heterosexual cisgender woman who was taught the importance of being a good Christian at home by my immigrant parents and by my Catholic school teachers over the course of 12 years. I'm here as somebody who began my post-secondary education in the biological sciences at Carnegie Mellon before moving into the fields of higher education and student affairs at the University of Vermont, and then later at the University of Michigan. I'm here as a wife and a mother, as somebody who's navigating the complexity of having a multiracial family in a space where monoracial families are the norm. I'm here as a former student affairs educator and current faculty member whose teaching, research, and scholarship is really centered in the desire to create more equitable and just educational environments. And that these environments are designed to foster the learning and development of all students while allowing them to be whole. And then finally, I'm here as an academic who lives a really full life outside of the academy. Somebody who enjoys a good cup of coffee, a good run, although not so much because Ann Arbor is much hillier than Iowa. And I love sports. Again, I'm from Cleveland, Ohio. But ultimately, I am here with you because who I am and how I navigate the world has really come to shape how I think about graduate education and how it does or does not relate to social justice. And that's really kind of the premise of the talk today. Where does engineering fit in to doing work related to social justice? So we spent a little time talking about my scholarship, and I want to talk a bit more about that in the broadest sense. My teaching, research, and my practice is related to college student learning and development. And again, this falls in 3 areas. So I look at meaning making and through the lens of self-authorship, and I've done that work primarily understanding undergraduate college students with the Wabash National Study of Liberal Arts Education, part of which was grounded here at the University of Michigan. And then my dissertation work looked at this process in student affairs educators. I have studied the nature of intercultural learning and development, and in particular, students' experiences in intergroup dialogues, the development of intercultural maturity, and most recently, I'm doing some work on the development of critical consciousness amongst undergraduate college students. And then finally, I would say most of my current research is centered on professional learning and development, and in particular, research that looks at the professional socialization of graduate students across the disciplines. So these bodies of work that I'm doing, I tend to use longitudinal qualitative methods to understand change over time. And I study in particular how individuals negotiate and make sense of the tensions between structure, so the things that constrain them, whether that be rules, policies, systems of oppression, and the agency that they have. That might be the ways that they think, and that may also be behavioral, kind of thinking about career choice or what options do I have to do with knowing the constraints that I live with. So although I'm describing these bodies of work as distinct, they overlap in a number of my projects. And I think today what I'm sharing with you is not just insights across my research on grad ed, but really bringing together my insights as a researcher who does work related to college students, and graduate students are college students, and how that work relates to DEI. So what do we know about grad ed? Much of the research, including my own, really focuses on 2 areas. First, many studies frame graduate education as a socialization process. So historically, graduate education is designed to hone students' expertise in their discipline or their field of study. So how do we become an expert engineer, and what does expertise look like? How does that manifest? Ideally, graduate education cultivates these experts who use their knowledge and skills to address societal challenges. And that can be as a faculty member, it can also be as a practitioner or someone working in industry. So to become an expert or a steward of the discipline, as Chris Goldie would say, graduate education is designed to socialize or teach people the norms, standards, core knowledge, and values of the areas of study. And in particular, the graduate education literature really highlights the pivotal role that faculty members play in this process. Faculty members help students learn skills, and they learn how to navigate academia, in particular if we're focusing on training faculty. And so the literature has ample information about faculty's roles as advisors and mentors, and how does that promote graduate student success? The literature also highlights the power of the apprenticeship model. And so typically that model has fallen to faculty. The idea that you learn to be a researcher under the guidance of somebody who's already seen as an expert. Now, in engineering and other STEM disciplines and fields, that apprenticeship model isn't solely located with a single faculty member. That also includes working with postdocs, a lab manager, and sometimes more seasoned graduate students who have more experiences. So the apprenticeship looks a little bit different in fields like engineering. We also know that graduate education, people have studied it as a system of social stratification that reproduces social inequalities. So for example, my friend and colleague Julie Passelt has studied how graduate admissions serves as a gatekeeping function, often to the detriment of women, racially minoritized people, low-income students, students with disabilities, first-gen students, so people who have a minoritized identity. If minoritized students do get admitted into graduate programs, they often face hostile climates in graduate school. Graduate school is hard. It's just hard. Learning to be an expert is very challenging. And the literature consistently demonstrates how that challenge is amplified for people with minoritized identities. And in particular, most of the literature centers women and people of color. Who, for example, might have less access to their faculty mentors or to advisors, and that can detract from degree progress and might limit their opportunities to become faculty. So that being said, the research that centers social stratification highlights that graduate education mirrors what we know about disparity. It amplifies what we know about oppression. So perhaps then it's not surprising that women and racially minoritized students complete their degrees at lower rates than their peers who are white and/or men. So we've spent a lot of time, researchers who study graduate education, highlighting challenges, right? And so one thing that keeps coming up is we need to improve the pipeline. We need to improve diversity in STEM, we know, and we need to improve diversity in engineering. Fewer women, fewer students of color are coming into the field. And if they come into grad ed in particular, they are not staying, right? So we argue that we need to build a pipeline. If we encourage people to come, surely the logic is we'll move people to the professoriate if we just get them in the pipeline. And so there's lots of programs aimed at increasing compositional diversity, recruiting more women and more people of color. So we might see this with undergraduate research programs and McNair to recruit underrepresented students into graduate programs. And now we see programs recruiting, moving students from undergraduate programs into graduate education. A more recent iteration of this pipeline expansion has been creating partnerships with HBCUs or Hispanic serving institutions. So really tapping into minority serving institutions. The urge to build a pipeline, we've also seen departments and institutions working to address challenges in admissions. So we see people getting trained, faculty getting trained on implicit bias, working to address holistic admissions, creating more holistic processes, and considering to some extent eliminating the GRE, since it is perhaps not a great predictor of graduate students' success in programs. And so while efforts to build the pipeline to and through graduate education are beneficial, the data shows that from the Council of Graduate Studies, we're having more women and people of color enter grad ed now more than ever, and yet they still aren't completing at the same rates as white men or white women. So there's something still not working. We're getting people in, and it's not quite working. I would argue in part that's because we don't consistently acknowledge how power, privilege, and oppression shape graduate education, and in turn, how we do or don't engage in work related to DEI. So the reality of the pipeline in graduate education is that the logic is flawed. So we spent a lot of time in engineering focusing on increasing compositional diversity. And by that, I mean, let's recruit more people and then let's add some support structures for minoritized students. So you might see mentoring programs or student orgs. What that does, though, is it doesn't fully acknowledge that the pipeline has lots of cracks and is consistently leaking. So every year, researchers do more and more studies to illuminate the hostile nature of the climate and inequitable practices that are built into the culture of departments, and some might argue into the field itself. So the system is broken because we're still reproducing these inequalities. And in effect, when we use or rely so heavily this logic of the pipeline, what we're often doing is trying to use Scotch tape to fix gaping holes in a pipeline that really, we haven't addressed the structural integrity of the pipe itself. We have yet to really think about how do we need to actually create a different pipeline instead of trying to fix the one we have, or is actually a pipeline the metaphor that we should be using. This ultimately, this kind of faulty logic negatively affects minoritized graduate students and the faculty and staff who work to support them. Now, I am not the first person and the only person to leverage this critique. And so, today, one of the things I hope you take away is really moving beyond the idea of the pipeline to really think about how do we want to reorganize engineering graduate education in support of diversity and inclusion, and perhaps to advance equity in the field. So I've really been sitting with this question, right? So knowing this pipeline doesn't work, I keep asking myself, how are we going to do this differently or better? What is the role of DEI in engineering graduate education? So to wrestle with that, I'm going to share some insights across several projects that I'm doing. I have 4 currently focused on DEI, and many of the participants in these studies, although they are not studies exclusively of engineers, there's a robust number of engineers who participate in these studies. So one of these studies has been conducted with my colleague, Dr. Claire Robbins at Virginia Tech, and we've examined what students learn about DEI and how that relates to how they understand their identities, their social identities, and their disciplinary identities relative to their field. The second study, I am involved in a National Science Foundation project, the CERTL AGET project, which is a group of 9 institutions working in a network improvement community that is creating and implementing interventions at the department level designed to improve racial climate. Now, the purpose of the network improvement community is that we share insights across the NIC with the idea that we might share good practices or talk through constraints of trying to do this work with departments, and that our shared wisdom might help us better collectively do the work. I'm also engaged in a project funded by the Spencer Foundation on the role of graduate colleges in advancing DEI. Grad colleges serve a unique role on many institutions and a different role on many campuses, but our initial insights from the first project I spoke to really highlight that grad colleges can be quite useful in advancing DEI. And then finally, I am in the midst of an NSF-funded project that is studying the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on graduate students. Now, this study, which is in progress, is really paying attention to students' perceptions of support, their mental health and well-being, and how these things relate to academic progress. And how are they making progress? How are they conceptualizing academic success? So these projects, I think, have surfaced some things for us to think about to perhaps re-envision the pipeline or contest how we might use that image in thinking about engineering graduate education. So the first study, I will say that there's a need for us to really scrutinize what graduate students learn about DEI in graduate training programs. Most research that explicitly looks at how students are socialized to DEI have been situated in helping professions. So student affairs, which is my field of practice, social work and counseling, where cultural competency is an expectation and the field itself espouses a commitment to social justice. So in those fields where it's an explicit expectation, people are trying to understand how much are we doing this work. My colleagues and I have asserted that when we omit DEI from graduate education and other disciplines and fields where it's not centered, um, it engages work in a way that's power and identity evasive. We don't talk about it explicitly, but it's still present. And doing that maintains that social stratification that I discussed earlier in the talk. It's always present even if we're not talking about it. And with this in mind, my colleagues and I conducted a study to look at graduate student socialization to DEI. And the work was conducted at two predominantly and historically white institutions. Our insights across 44 participants, most of whom held at least one minoritized identity and included a good number of engineers given the institutions where we conducted the studies, provided some helpful and useful information about the content, process, and outcomes of socialization to DEI. So our findings told us that graduate students learned quite a bit about the value of compositional diversity. And in particular, I would say in STEM fields, including engineering, what they learned about DEI was often in relation to funding agencies. So diversity, compositional diversity, having more women, more people of color was important in part because it is a requirement of a grant. To get X kind of funding, you need to show a commitment to recruiting more diverse people, or for an NIH grant, if it's a training grant, like what does that look like? What's the support structure in place? So students really learned it's important to have people around, but often to fulfill what they would say was a checkbox, like an expectation that was external. They also learned that diversity and inclusion was important at the institutional level. So if your university says we need to change the climate because a racist incident happened, our CDO is responding, our chief diversity officer is responding to campus incidents or a climate survey, then we all need to get on board. So the messaging was often external, but that didn't mirror what people were learning in their departments. Interestingly enough, most of our participants could not talk about what equity was because that was not a thing at the department level. So diversity, getting more people who are different, often around race and gender, and inclusion, making sure people feel comfortable, safe, and included was important, but equity was a really big challenge for folks to negotiate. Now, with respect to how students learned, participants really highlighted the role that their faculty and to some extent the broader department played in shaping their understandings of DEI. Now, while a few participants highlighted the role of faculty and coursework in centering DEI, most folks told us that faculty either omitted or sent explicitly negative messages about the role of DEI in their discipline and field. So for example, Juan, a Latino engineering doctoral student, shared with us, well, my first advisor told me, this was before he saw my true colors, oh, I don't want you to be involved in any of that Latino stuff. That was a clear message to me. Just work hard and research. Juan's advisor asked him to ignore his identity and his racialized experiences as Latino, which he could not do. Juan he was not just Latino, and he wasn't just an engineer, he was a Latino engineer. And the idea of keeping those things as compartmentalized was impossible for him. And that really, this was one of the reasons he ended up looking for a new advisor. If you can't see me for who I am, and I can't be Latino here, I can't be here. And that was very challenging for him and for other students to negotiate, who told you cannot be yourself in the space, just be a researcher, just be an engineer. Since some of our participants didn't discuss DEI in their departments, people went to other spaces. They had to look elsewhere. And often that required looking to the graduate college, which is how I ended up doing the Spencer study. The graduate college played a big role in supplementing students' learning at both of the campuses where we did this study. People really talked about how graduate college staff provided opportunities for them to learn. They took classes there. They went to programs in the graduate college because it wasn't happening at the department. Even though in concept, the departments are supposed to shape our understanding of the discipline and field. But if it's not addressing DEI, students have to go elsewhere. Students also really talked about the pivotal role that identity-centered organizations played in teaching them about DEI in their discipline and field. So in engineering, students talking about the Society for Women Engineers or the National Society of Black Engineers as being spaces, since we can't talk about it in the lab or in my classes, this is where I get to be a woman engineer. This is where I get to be a Black engineer. Students really look to those spaces, not to just be with people who shared their identities, but those were also spaces where students talked about developing their leadership skills and, for some really started to engage in activism and advocacy. Now, based on these experiences, the messages that students learned about DEI, they were really frustrated because I'm just a checkbox. I'm not going, it doesn't really matter to a lot of people here. And so what they really highlighted to us was the missed opportunities for faculty to engage. So even if it wasn't relevant to the curriculum, students talked about campus events that were happening. There were opportune times to talk about DEI. So the example, we collected a lot of this data in 2016. So before, leading up to, and after the 2016 presidential election. And so students were telling us about posters going up on campus that were centering white supremacy, or hearing chants of "Build That Wall" on the campus. And for students who didn't hear anything from their faculty, when they felt very targeted, even if it wasn't specifically in the lab or in the academic department, it gave them the signal that they weren't particularly important and that they weren't cared for. So since students received explicit messages that DEI didn't belong in their fields and that they certainly shouldn't be their full selves in the lab, people felt tokenized, targeted, and unsafe. These messages led folks to wonder if they were a good fit in their particular department, and in some instances in the broader field. So if I can't be a Latino engineer here, can I be a Latino engineer anywhere? Some participants, though, the resistance from faculty, students sometimes were inspired to be change agents. So if my faculty aren't going to engage with these ideas, I'm going to make it better for the people behind me. And they saw themselves as a vital process of re-socializing people in the future as faculty. And that need to create change sometimes helped people persist in environments that were challenging and at times toxic. So I would argue there's also a great need for revisiting the notions of labs as family, particularly as we think about where does DEI fit in. And in engineering and other STEM areas, labs are often framed as families that serve as students' home base over the course of your graduate career. You're going to spend more time in your lab than you are in coursework and in other spaces at the university. So as part of our AGEP research, my colleagues and I have conducted focus groups at 2 institutions, predominantly white institutions, in the network improvement community. And these 2 institutions have pretty compositionally diverse engineering programs and other STEM programs, and they are nationally known for being able to recruit students of color into their programs. One paper that we have written has examined how students of color describe their experiences in labs and how these experiences affect them. So students of color in STEM labs can certainly have positive experiences where they describe their families in the positive connotation of family, where people feel supported, nurtured, empowered, cared for. That's I think the framing of family for some connotes this positive image. Yet a lot of participants characterize their labs as sites of competition and isolation. So Terry, an engineering doctoral student, shared with us the isolation that they felt. They said, it's the nature of there not being a lot of underrepresented minorities. When you get to graduate school in particular, everything becomes hyper-focused. One of the people of color I've met at this focus group has been here for 6 years, and I've never seen them until today. There are other graduate students who I know are in my program that I don't see on a daily basis, and they're in the same engineering discipline. They're in the same building as me. So for students of color like Terry, the structure of the lab, the idea that you are in this space very focused on work, cultivating expertise, intensified the isolation. So if you're one of few or one of the only, and your work is designed to be in a singular space, if you're not in a lab that has other people of color, whether that be students, postdocs, a PI, or a lab manager, you are by yourself, and there's very little opportunity to reach out and across. And that point of, you can be in the same program and the same building, but if the work is structured to isolate you into one space, it doesn't really always matter that there's other students of color. There's not an opportunity, or faculty of color. There's just no opportunity to engage with them if you're always in the lab. Now, people also described labs, again, as sites of competition where people were vying for the PI's attention and for opportunities. And this led many students to reframe family. So sometimes they would say, oh, my lab's a family. And my response would be, well, what kind of family? Tell me about your family. And students would say, well, my family's pretty dysfunctional. And by that, they meant students were fighting with each other or undermining each other at times, sometimes feeling controlled by the PI who really did control and constrain access to resources and opportunities, which shaped timeline to degree. So the ways that this showed up, for example, where somebody described their PI as the father figure and dad holds the purse strings. The question of whether or not you get your allowance was an important one. Another student speculated, and this was in engineering, their lab had an advanced student who had a very specialized skill set, knew how to run a particular piece of equipment and do particular experiments that it was very difficult to learn to do, and no one else knew how to do it. But they had been there for, I think it was 6 or 7 years, and other students were starting to speculate, I wonder if they're not being allowed to graduate because they're the only one who knows how to do this. So it was family. The student was financially supported, and yet not always the most positive connotation for family. So again, given that lab families were functioned in all sorts of different ways, sometimes caring and supportive and sometimes truly dysfunctional, people were again looking outside of the lab and outside of the program for support if they were just going to make it through. And this led many students to really think about how they were going to change climate, both of their lab and of their departments. So this brings me to my third insight, that really engaging in DEI work in engineering and rethinking grad ed requires that we acknowledge and reward the work graduate students are doing to change lab and departmental climate. So this AGEP CERTL project that I'm working on, we actually just submitted a paper the other day, for a conference that examined what roles do students play in working to change the climate of their department, and how does this work affect students? Oops, sorry, I went too far ahead. I'm having technological challenges. So we found that STEM students played a number of roles in their departments. They supplemented faculty's labor. They were catalysts of change, and they were just straight up laborers. They did the work. These roles were interrelated with each other, and I would say that they were received differently by faculty and departmental leaders, depending on how it was perceived by the faculty in terms of encroaching on what they perceived as purview of the faculty. So students were rewarded when they created recruitment initiatives, led mentoring programs, and maybe did things to improve the lab. Where faculty were resistant, the example we have is students demanded that this department, get rid of the GRE because it wasn't a good predictor of graduate student success. And the department was already considering that. But once the graduate students demanded it, one of the faculty members shared with us that people just dug their heels in, and it wasn't about the GRE, it was the principle of who decides. So these kind of who makes decisions, who has the power, is certainly relevant. So since graduate students were leading lots of initiatives, faculty did not always take up DEI work. And in some cases, they gave themselves pats on the back and took credit for graduate students' work. Like, look at all the work we're doing to recruit these students of color. When the reality is, it was students who created programs and tried to create their own pipeline. It was institutionally supported, but the work on the ground was really on students. Now, graduate students often noted that their work to change environments was detrimental to their mental health and to their degree progress. So Emily, a racially minoritized woman, described this to us when she said, it's either situation A, where you're productive and you're like, I want to implement these changes, and my friends and the people who are coming behind me in the future, and you're physically dedicating an hour or two. But it's also situation B, if you're not in that active role, your mental health is suffering because I'm not being productive and I'm not being heard. That's also taking away from productivity in my work, which is just the spiral of you're not being productive and you're feeling crappier. So in many ways, students like Emily describe being in a catch-22. So if they don't work to change the climate, particularly if faculty are not being particularly engaged in that work, if they don't change it, they're suffering. They're having a not positive experience. They are feeling devalued. And it's hard to make academic progress when you feel as though you don't matter, aren't cared for, or maybe aren't equitably funded or getting what you need to succeed. Some students aren't getting the mentoring. But if you do the work to change the environment, she highlights, well, that has cost too. I don't get to do as much work on my academics, and it still leaves me emotionally exhausted. Many students who are doing this work to change climate in their labs and in their departments suffer because the work is invisible and they rarely reap the tangible rewards. And certainly many of them are not compensated financially for their labor. And really what they're working to do is to make their environments places that are more survivable. I won't even go as far as thriving, but really just how do I get through this in one piece? Which is a question graduate students shouldn't have to ask themselves on such a regular basis. So that being said, across my work, I really do think there's a need to move beyond the pipeline, often think about the entering, but really to engage more with the infrastructures, right? The body of the pipe, the structural integrity. What are we going to do that is intended to sustain success once people enter? And how do we address what Leonard Cassuto calls the graduate school mess? To improve engineering graduate education, I think there's a need for us to be creative about rethinking the whole enterprise. Now, I'm certainly not an engineer or an engineering faculty member. And so I, I think I'm going to offer some questions that I would encourage you to consider with your colleagues, because I think they might prompt us to engage instead of fixing, which I think is important. Is there something for re-envisioning, starting over, reconstructing, which is a bit different than adding more Scotch tape or maybe some sturdy duct tape? So what would happen if we moved away from the apprenticeship model, where you work with one people or a group of people? What would grad ed look like then? How would we teach people what it means to be an engineer? What would happen if we recognize the value of students' identities and their lived experiences on a more consistent basis? How would that shape how we teach? What would our advising look like? What would lab meetings look like if we stay in labs? How would graduate education change if publication and grants weren't the markers of success? So that's a bigger question, because I think that's a big question for all academics. How would faculty reward systems change? How would that change the time or energy that we have to mentor students? How would our DEI work be rewarded differently if people weren't focusing always on trying to bring in more money or publish more? Like, what would that mean for faculty work? And in turn, how would that shape how we engage with students? What if we consistently and regularly named power, privilege, and oppression and how they affect how we construct knowledge? So what we think is valid and real, how we come to know, how we think about rigor and what makes something good or rigorous, and who and what is valued in the academy. Just what if? And then finally, what would happen if we rewarded students, and I would argue, faculty and postdocs as well, for the work that they do to improve the climates that they're in? What would that look like if we were to reward that more seriously or give it equal weight to other things that we tend to privilege in the academy? So I finished by showing a picture of, this is me graduating from Michigan in 2014. And that's my daughter, Ella, who is now 8.5, right? And I'm smiling in this picture. I was very happy to graduate. I felt very supported in my program. Sometimes though, the smiles at graduation are because people are so happy they survived. They're relieved that they made it through the gauntlet. What would happen if what would we need to do that when we saw smiles at graduation, they weren't smiles of survival? They weren't, I'm so happy I made it. What would it look like, feel like for students, the faculty, postdocs, staff that work with them, if we re-envisioned graduate education to be a place where people thrived? They smiled because it was truly joyful and not just because you got through, where people felt whole, felt honored, and where they could do scholarship and engage in practice that was designed to both honor who they are, but perhaps to contest and maybe even dismantle inequitable systems that we are constrained by. So at this point, thank you so much for your time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that we can open up for questions. And I think if you have questions, you are welcome to submit them through, I think there's a question and answer box, or you may send them to me. Yes.
Great. I think, thanks so much for your session. It was really inspiring. I love how all of the different pieces of your research weave together and they connect in with so many interests that we have in the College of Engineering. I have a specific question that goes back to something you mentioned early on. And it had something to do with not requiring the GRE score for admission to graduate school. This year with the pandemic, I think pretty much nobody is requiring the GRE score. And in fact, we are in the engineering education research program, explicitly not allowing the score to be reported. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about what kind of data we should be collecting this year to provide some justification for either requiring it going forward or to continue not requiring it.
Great. So I think what's difficult about the GRE is that we know lots of folks can be really excellent in the practice of the work, and particularly not strong test takers. And I think we also know that some of these standardized tests have some bias in them. So I always say use them with caution if you're going to, and put them in context. Truth be told, I was somebody who was not a fantastic GRE scorer, and that sometimes that requirement leads students to apply or not apply to different places. It literally can shape whether or not the students you want to apply sometimes will consider it, either due to the cost or they're not sure if they scored well. I think certainly as people look at undergraduate scores, I mean, I think that's undergraduate grades, that's one thing, but I think about what is the work of graduate school. So as folks are, doing research, their grades might not be great, but if their performance in research with a faculty advisor as an undergraduate, for example, like I think it's more some of the soft data. And I think that is what is challenging, that it's not a metric. I think you can certainly look at graduate school grades, like as you think about if you have a cohort that doesn't have GRE scores for a year, like does the performance look somewhat similar, that when you did require the GRE, if it looks somewhat similar or even better, this might tell you, give you some cues about whether or not the GRE was particularly useful. So I think there's also a need for just conversation about how people want to use those GRE scores. So sometimes people collect them and they, what I would call, use them in context. So like look at them next to the undergraduate or graduate grades if they've had a master's degree, to really put those in context. Because sometimes if the grades are high but the GRE is low, how do you make sense of that discrepancy and how are you going to weigh them? So I know that's kind of circular, but that is something that I have been thinking about. Like, can you use this year as a good test to see what kind of grades and performance in lab students have? Like, are they learning? I think can be one way. So there's a question in the chat. I'll read it aloud for folks. How do you reconcile the reality experienced by a lot of minoritized graduate students in your recruitment efforts as a faculty member? And this is from a graduate student. So how do you, that's a really good question. So I guess I think I'm just honest with students and talking about what is challenging, right? And I work from a space of critical hope. And by that, I mean, I don't pretend that climate is negative or that it is not challenging. But I do work from a space of actively working to reconstruct it to be different and or better. I've asked students when I recruit, I really do ask them to think about what they need for the totality of their lives. I think it is, as somebody who left a full-time job, so you might have folks coming back from industry, right? What does it mean to leave a salaried job to come for a graduate student stipend? And really talking honestly with folks about what is livable, like what are the things that you most need? And they might not all be in one place, but kind of weighing like what are some of the non-negotiables. I don't think there's a great answer, but I do think we can be more transparent. And I also think, though, we can't oversell. Like, I don't also want to oversell that as a faculty member of color, I'm going to be somebody's everything, because that's also not fair to me or the student, because the reality is one faculty member should not be somebody's everything when coming to grad school. I'm very clear about telling folks that, because, you lead lives outside of school. And I think if we ask students, like, what do you think you need to be successful, and really trying to think, does our program offer those things? Does our community offer those things? That's a really different way of thinking about recruitment. I also don't recruit just to work with me. So I think that's another kind of difference in my particular department, where you recruit to the program broadly. So I'm happy to talk more about that at another point. So there's some commentary here about the apprenticeship model. So one argument I've heard for the apprenticeship model is that it creates a mechanism for deciding when students have succeeded in achieving their doctorate. No two doctorates look the same, so we use a committee because it takes one to know one. If we don't use papers or an apprenticeship to decide when students have finished, how might we? What other standards might we use? So I guess what I'll say is I'm not confident that we need to move away from a dissertation. I think sometimes the apprenticeship, though, is so tight that you only work with one person, and that doesn't always give flexibility to explore. I understand, it's not that students can find their own resources either, but I think there is a need to rethink, if somebody's going to be in an apprenticeship, what does that relationship look like? What are the PI's expectations? What are the students' expectations? And having like some frank discussion of what that looks like. I don't think that happens in conversations with lots of students, including in my own field, but people don't talk about that. They just come thinking they're going to work closely with somebody. And if you have a very large lab, if you have a lab of 20, there's no way the PI is spending individual time. Maybe they are. Maybe they're a time master, a much better time manager than me, but they might not invest. They might not have the capacity to do that, right? So the apprenticeship might also be with a postdoc, with senior graduate students, but I think there's a need to really think through, what do those mentoring relationships look like to get through. I'm not opposed to using research or a 3-paper model, but I'm not confident that everybody knows the expectations up front. And so sometimes for students, the line keeps moving, and that becomes really challenging. Let's think. There is another question about how might we reconcile faculty incentives such as P&T with DEI intents? Well, I think about this all the time, and I have argued very strongly, if you're going to say it's a university value, why are we not evaluating people on their contributions? Now, it's a bit harder to say, I'm not expecting somebody to say, I'm going to spend 10% of my time on DEI work. But I do think there is a really explicit need for people to, at minimum, engage in some reflective practice about this. If we say it's important and there's no form of evaluation, you never have to talk about it, you don't have to do it. This is how we find ourselves in situations where the university says it's important for the grant, and then students are doing it because someone's going to needs to do it. I had argued in my previous department, like, we keep saying this is a core value of our department, then why, even if it's slightly different than what we have to put forward to the university, can we at least reflect on this and put it into our evaluations with our department chair? Because it really was, students are asking us, and as well they should, to enact our stated commitments. I think if we're going to say it, we have to be able to create some systems to do that. I also know that sometimes that also means, though, some folks are inequitably doing that DEI work, which is both time consuming, but also like emotionally exhausting, and not all service is built the same. And so I'm not sure if I have a solution, as much as the more that we talk around it and just call it service when it's more than service. Like, I argue that my DEI work is more than service to the university or service to the department or college. It is literally making this a place I can be, and a place where students can thrive. So that is, I think, reframing what DEI work is. It shouldn't just be like an extra service provides, connotes an add-on. And I would argue it should be core. So thank you for the thoughtful question.